Okay. Let me share my screen. And go up to where we left off, which I think was with cerebral lateralization. Okay. So just kind of, I'll pick up where we left off on Monday. So when it comes to cerebral lateralization, that term is used to describe the phenomenon by which the hemispheres, although mirror images of one another, there are differences. There are structural differences. We looked at Petalius's. And then there are differences functionally speaking when it comes to the left versus the right hemisphere. Again, the left hemisphere is what we call the categorical hemisphere. The left hemisphere is associated with language. Language also, which is, as you can see here, verbal memory. We'll get into where memories are stored when it comes to the cerebrum at the end of this lecture. But associated, again, the left hemisphere with kind of math, reasoning, maybe not reasoning, but mathematical abilities and language. And then the right hemisphere, and this is, and I should say, this is for the vast majority of people, statistically speaking, and in part, there's an association between that and being right-handed, right? So most, statistically speaking, most people are right-handed. And so this schematic is used to describe, again, most right-handed people, which most statistically speaking, that's most of the people out there. So the right hemisphere is what we call the representational hemisphere. You can kind of think of the right hemisphere as being associated with the seat of our imagination, with artistic ability, musical ability, spatial orientation, if you will. All of that is associated with the right hemisphere. And then, as I mentioned on Monday, when it comes to left-handed people, these category or these descriptors can be reversed. So for left-handed people, not all, but for some left-handed people, the left hemisphere is actually the representational hemisphere and the right is the categorical. Is there anything else I want to say with regards to the slide? Oh, and then I guess, and we'll talk about seizures here in a moment, but the corpus callosum, which is kind of that upper lip, if you will, of the lateral ventricle, is made up of tracts that allow for communication between the two hemispheres. And it's also worth noting right now that if damage, that the two hemispheres, especially if damage occurs to the brain earlier on in life, and kind of the earlier, the more, being young is associated with plasticity when it comes to the brain. So if there's brain damage that has occurred early on in life to, for example, the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere does a really good job of taking over the function. And again, you know, in cases in which this happens and individuals are very prepubescent and especially really young, so 5 and younger, you, functionally speaking, there can be no loss of function. With adults, damage, the one hemisphere can still kind of pick up the slack, if you will, for the other, but just not as efficiently. So there's typically loss of function associated with damage that occurs to either hemisphere as an adult. And again, that can be somewhat compensated for more effectively when we are younger. So again, so this brings us nicely to this slide, which discusses some clinical views that are associated with seizure activity, and we call the blanket term used to describe seizure activity for a variety of different underlying etiologies is what we call epilepsy. Epilepsy, the seizure activity itself is due to kind of errant action potential activities. So neurons firing off action potentials erroneously and in multiple areas of the brain. And then that causes kind of a short circuiting, if you will. Seizures are, for most epileptics, um, the seizure activity can be controlled pretty effectively with different types of medications, ranging from, the what we call the benzodiazepines through specific medications that are just seizure medications. But however, for kind of a small percentage of people with epilepsy, if that seizure activity is not well controlled, um, one of the procedures that is done to help manage the seizure activity is severing part, if not all, of the corpus callosum. So, kind of interrupting that communication from the left to the right hemisphere. Because what happens with seizure activity is that if the corpus callosum is intact and functioning, and a seizure begins, pardon me, on one side of the brain, those action potentials can spread to the other hemisphere, and it makes the seizure activity more extreme. So in severing that communication, it can help control or kind of lessen the effects of the seizures for the individual that has epilepsy. Okay, another clinical view are what we call CVAs, which stands for cerebrovascular accidents, and then commonly called strokes. So a stroke occurs when blood supply, oxygenated blood, that supply is disrupted to a portion of the brain. And then that disruption results in death or necrosis of that tissue. We talked earlier, and we've seen that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and vice versa when it comes to the right side of the brain and the left side of the body. And so with strokes, loss of function will be seen on the opposite side from where the accident occurred. So again, if the blockage occurs to the right hemisphere, that, depending on where the blockage occurs, that will determine what the extent and the area of the brain that's damaged, and the manifestation of that is seen on the left side of the body. And then TIAs, that acronym stands for trans ischemic attacks. So TIAs, you can think of TIAs as kind of mini strokes. TIAs are due to disruptions in blood flow, oxygenated blood flow to the brain, but not to the extent where notable tissue death occurs. So TIAs, some of the hallmarks of TIAs are kind of this transient confusion, and one of the things that separates TIAs from a stroke with regard to kind of degree of damage is, again, with TIAs, blood loss is impaired, or I'm sorry, blood flow is impaired, but it's established pretty quickly, and so there's not tissue death that is associated with TIAs. And with the stroke, that blockage results in necrosis. Okay, so now moving on and talking about the cerebral nuclei. So if you could think back to when we first started this material and we were talking about the distribution of white and gray matter in the brain. And I mentioned that for the brain, and the pattern is reversed when you compare the brain to the spinal cord, but for the brain, we have gray matter on the outside, and then deep to that gray matter is white matter. And the gray matter, again, is gray because it's made up of the cell bodies of neurons and neuroglial cells and dendrites of neurons, and portions of unmyelinated axons. And then the white matter is white because of myelination. So it's made up primarily of myelinated axons. And then kind of scattered within the white matter of the brain are these islands of gray matter, and those are called the cerebral nuclei. So the functionally speaking, the cerebral nuclei are there to help regulate motor output, which is what I have here. So they are not responsible for initiating motor function, but they help to regulate it and kind of streamline it and filter out unnecessary movements. So, and we see diseases of the cerebral nuclei as such manifest themselves as typically, I should say, as diseases that are motor type of the impairments of motor function. So, and we'll talk in a few slides about Huntington's and Parkinson's disease. But I think kind of along those lines, it's worth mentioning that, again, going back to kind of what we started talking when we got into this material, what we mentioned is that when it comes to the brain, there's so much that we still don't know and we're still discovering. And so, although the cerebral nuclei, functionally speaking, they're primary and historically what we know about cerebral nuclei is that they play an important role in regulating motor function. There's also a lot of research looking at the association of the cerebral nuclei to other non-motor related types functions. So, for example, cognition and memory and emotion, and the role that these nuclei, and again, just as by way of reminder, when it comes to definitions, nuclei, when we're talking about the central nervous system, that's the word that we use to describe collections of cell bodies, right? That's why they're these little islands of gray matter. They're little collections of cell bodies that are deep to the gray matter on the outside of the brain and scattered within the white matter. So when it comes to the nuclei, some of the components that I want you to be familiar with. So the amygdala, we'll talk in a moment here about the limbic system, which is made up of parts of the brain that are involved in emotion and impulse control in the fear response. And the amygdala is a very important part of the limbic system. The amygdala is made up of collections of cell bodies that, again, play an important role in impulse control and reaction to fear, what you as an individual, what initiates fear. So, for example, if damage to the amygdala occurs, that often manifests itself as or manifests itself in people having either flat affect or kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Inappropriate response to a particular situation that you might encounter. And also, damage to the amygdala can cause what would otherwise be a fear invoking type situation to not register with that person as being fear inducing. And there's tons of interesting research that looks at the amygdala and its role in personality and, various psychiatric conditions and psychopathy and lots of interesting research out there. So I want you to be familiar with that component of the cerebral nuclei. The lentiform nucleus, which the putamen is a part of that, helps control, again, it's a component of the cerebral nuclei, so it helps to control motor output and helps to kind of refine movement. And those are the two. Let me just mention the caudate nucleus. And if I skip over some material, it's not that that's not very important. I'm trying to kind of highlight areas that are that clinically you'll learn about when you get to pathophysiology and have a lot of clinical relevancy. But that's not to say the caudate nucleus in the classroom aren't incredibly important. I'm just focusing primarily on the amygdala and the lentiform nucleus when it comes to components of the cerebral nuclei that I want you to know as for testing purposes. Okay, so the diencephalon. The diencephalon is made up of the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. And you can think of the diencephalon as an area of a region of the brain as being a relay center. So it's a relay center where you get motor and sensory pathways converging on one another. This is also where visceral motor output is run through and initiated by components of the diencephalon. So the epithalamus is an area that it covers the third ventricle, which the ventricle again is a space. And as far as structures that are associated with the epithalamus, we have the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is obviously an important part of the brain, and it's also an endocrine structure. And the hormone that it secretes is melatonin. And melatonin is a hormone that is involved with or responsible for controlling circadian rhythms, so sleep wake cycles. And then the habenular nuclei, the habenular nuclei is an important part or is a component of the epithalamus, and it is an important part of the limbic system. So it is responsible for passing signals from structures within the limbic system to the midbrain, and is also plays an important role in our emotional response to odors. So the thalamus here, which we're just about to talk about, the thalamus is the filter for the brain. And this is kind of, there's a research that goes in that somewhat contradicts this, but by and large, everything again is filtered through the thalamus except for olfaction. So except for smells. There is a lot of research that shows that the thalamus does in fact filter out some smells, but compared to the other senses and the other sensory information coming into the brain, smells are kind of by and large unfiltered. And so the habenular nuclei, which is a part of the diencephalon along with the thalamus, plays an important role in our emotional response and along with parts of the frontal lobe and our associations of odors with particular memories. So for example, if you close your eyes and you smell, the scent of apple pie, and that was something that you always had with your grandmother growing up, and those are kind of warm, fuzzy memories for you. The habenular nuclei plays an important role in that response of smelling apple pie and the warm, fuzzy feeling that you might have without even being able to consciously say why the smell of apple pie makes you feel warm and fuzzy. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so the thalamus, again, the thalamus is the filter of the brain. The thalamus filters out all of the sensory information that comes in that is underconscious, that we are aware of under conscious control. Again, mostly except for olfaction. And then it filters out the information that's coming in, and it essentially directs that information to where it needs to go within the cerebrum, right? So if damage to the thalamus occurs, one of the clinical manifestations for damage to the thalamus is this kind of sensory overload, to the point where people kind of can't function because there's so much sensory information that's not being filtered. The thalamus kind of gets to decide, if you will, what sensory information is important and needs to be processed and by the brain, and so that you're kind of, decides what you need to be aware of, what you're conscious of, and then kind of disregards the other sensory information that's coming in. So again, think of the thalamus as the filter of the brain. Okay, and then the last part of the diencephalon is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is both an important structure within the brain, and also it's the master control center of the endocrine system, which is a system that's made up of organs, tissues, and organs that secrete hormones. So there are 7 major functions of the hypothalamus. Again, control of the endocrine system is one of the major functions. So when we get to the endocrine system, we'll talk about the hormones associated with the different organs and structures of the endocrine system. And I'll repeat this information to you when we get there, but make note of it right now that any hormone that has the term releasing hormone in it, that comes from the hypothalamus. So we have, for example, thyroid releasing hormone. And then that's going to be a hormone that goes down and crosstalks with the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is so the pituitary gland is physically attached to the hypothalamus, and there's an anterior and a posterior portion of the pituitary gland. The posterior portion of the pituitary gland is physically attached to the hypothalamus. by what we call the infundibulum. And then the anterior portion of the hypothalamus, of the pituitary gland, is not physically attached to the hypothalamus. However, the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus will go to the anterior, will get into the blood, travel to the anterior pituitary gland, and stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones. It's kind of more on that to come when we get to the endocrine system. But master control of the endocrine system is one of the major functions of the hypothalamus. The second major function of the hypothalamus is that it is the control center for the autonomic nervous system. So for the fight and flight response, which is the sympathetic nervous system response, and rest and digest, which is what the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for controlling. So as such, the hypothalamus plays a really important role in regulating things such as respiration, right? So respiratory rate when we are in fight or flight mode, respiratory rate increases when we are sleeping and resting and trying to kind of acquire energy. Respiratory rate decreases, right? And that's controlled ultimately by the hypothalamus. Same thing with blood pressure. When we are in fight or flight mode, heart rate and thus blood pressure go up. When we are sleeping or resting, heart rate and blood pressure drop. Again, those things are controlled by the hypothalamus. Regulation of body temperature is another important function of the hypothalamus. So there is the sensory information with regard to the ambient temperature, if you will, is detected by receptors, and then that information is sent to the hypothalamus, and body temperature is adjusted accordingly in order to maintain a temperature of roughly 98 degrees Fahrenheit within the body. So if it's cold outside, that information is sent to the hypothalamus, and then there are functions that the hypothalamus essentially enacts within the body, such as shivering, for example, and increasing the metabolic rate that will generate heat and therefore keep the body temperature more or less stable. The fourth major function of the hypothalamus is control of emotional behavior. So when it comes to the limbic system, which I mentioned a moment ago, the hypothalamus is a very important part of the limbic system. It ultimately is the part of the limbic system that is the master control center for your subjective experience of fear and anger and pleasure, and aggression and sex drive. All of that is ultimately controlled by the hypothalamus. And then control of food intake. So the hypothalamus is responsible for producing sensations of hunger when the caloric needs of the body are not being met, ideally. It does so in part by monitoring levels of various macromolecules in their building blocks within the blood. And then control of water, kind of hand in hand with that, is control of water intake. So the hypothalamus secretes, makes and then stores a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. It stores it in the posterior pituitary gland, and then the posterior pituitary gland is the structure responsible for secreting ADH. But what ADH, so again, it stands for antidiuretic hormone, and diuresis is the word used to describe urine production. So that ADH literally means anti-urine making hormone. And what this hormone does is it causes, so at the level of the kidney, blood is filtered, and the product of that filtration is urine. And the major component of urine is water. So when the hypothalamus signals the posterior pituitary gland to secrete the ADH, which is made by the hypothalamus. What that hormone does is it causes water that is within what's going to become urine. We call that substance filtrate. It causes water within the filtrate to be reabsorbed or taken back into the blood, right? So the result of ADH secretion is that you make less urine from a volume standpoint that is more concentrated. Another way to think to otherwise put, or another way to think of it is that in the presence of ADH, you stay well hydrated, right? Because ADH causes you to pull water from what would be urine back into the blood. ADH, the hypothalamus is a structure that is very sensitive to alcohols, right? So this is the reason why if you drink alcohol, if you've ever consumed alcohol, a phenomenon that is associated with drinking alcohol after several drinks is this phenomenon by which you start to make copious amounts of relatively dilute urine. And then if you drink too much alcohol, you wake up the next day with what is commonly called a hangover, right? And one of the major components of a hangover is dehydration. And the reason that you get dehydrated is because if you drink too much alcohol, it basically kind of numbs the hypothalamus. And so the hypothalamus, which typically secretes, let's say quantity X of ADH to keep you hydrated, if you drink too much alcohol, the hypothalamus essentially becomes numb and it does not secrete the amount of ADH that is required to keep you hydrated. And so that's why you start making copious amounts of dilute urine, is because you're not pulling the amount of water out of the filtrate, which will become urine, that is required to keep you hydrated. And then being dehydrated makes you feel lousy. So somewhat tangential, but definitely related. Okay. And then finally, regulation of sleep-wake cycles. So the hypothalamus is the structure, again, it's kind of the master control center. So it is the structure that's responsible for telling the pineal gland, if you will, or cross-talking, stimulating the pineal gland to secrete melatonin. So as such, the hypothalamus is ultimately the structure that's responsible for determining circadian rhythms, but it does so by way of the pineal gland. Okay. And then the brain stem, which is the last region of the brain that we will be discussing. So the brain stem itself is made up of what's called the midbrain, and then the pons and the medulla oblongata. From a functional standpoint, the brain stem is the part of the brain that connects the cerebrum, right, the cerebral cortex, to the diencephalon, which again is epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus, and the cerebellum, which we've not yet discussed, and it connects those structures to the spinal cord. Many of the autonomic, and actually, when I said this is the last region of the brain we're going to talk about, I was wrong. We've not talked about the cerebellum yet. Anyway, so this region of the brain has many of our reflex centers, and it houses the cell bodies of many cranial nerves. So what I want you to know about the midbrain. So the midbrain itself plays an important role, kind of in a similar fashion to when we were talking about the cerebral nuclei. The midbrain plays an important role in regulating motor output. One region that I want you to be familiar with of the midbrain is the substantia nigra. So the substantia nigra is called the substantia nigra because this area of the brain has a lot of melanin, melanin is the pigment molecule of the body that gives a dark color, right? So we find melanin in the skin. It's secreted in greater amounts within the dermis. in the presence of UV light. And then we find melanin in the eyes. That's what gives ultimately eyes, determines eye color. So the more melanin we have, the darker the eye color. And then the less melanin, the lighter the eye color. So blue eyes are not actually due to, for example, a blue pigment. Individuals with blue eyes just don't have as much melanin in their iris as individuals with dark brown eyes. And from a functional standpoint, the substantia nigra has many neurons that secrete dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a very, very important role in pleasure. So our ability to experience, which again, experiential types of anything that's experiential is going to be subjective. But what we know is that when dopamine levels are decreased, or when dopamine receptors are downregulated, the subjective experience that individuals report is an inability to experience pleasure. And conversely, when dopamine levels are high, that is reported, subjectively speaking, by individuals. They will say that the high dopamine is associated with the pleasure response. Dopamine levels also play a really important role in pain management. So when there are dopamine deficiencies, or when receptors to dopamine are downregulated, not only do people report an inability to experience pleasure, they also report an intolerance or greater intolerance to pain. So pain thresholds go down when dopamine is not around. And then conversely, when dopamine levels are higher, people tend to report feeling pleasure and also have a greater tolerance for pain. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide, but when it comes to brain disorders associated with structures, homeostatic imbalances associated with some of the structures we were just discussing, here's some different clinical terminology that I want you to be familiar with. So headaches are just what they sound like. They make up a group of disorders by which person reports pain somewhere in the head. There are different types of headaches. Some can be due to either structural abnormalities or blockages, such as sinus headaches that are due usually to an accumulation of mucus in the sinuses. And then, on kind of the other end of the spectrum, we have migraine headaches, which are typically, they're associated with abnormalities in blood flow. And it's kind of just the skinny on it. I'm trying to be very broad because there's lots and lots of research as to what causes migraines and how best to treat them. But that's all I'm requiring that you know for this class right now. Cerebral palsy is another homeostatic imbalances that is usually due to damage that occurs during the birthing process. It can also occur due to damage that happens in utero. And cerebral palsy it's a motor disorder. So individuals who have cerebral palsy there are motor deficiencies, but there's no loss of cognition as an important part of cerebral palsy. I have on here sometimes there are problems with cognition, but by and large, cognition is not affected. And then encephalitis is a term I want you to be familiar with. And encephalitis is the word that we use to describe inflammation of the brain. So encephalitis, as far as the underlying etiology, it can be viral in nature, it can be bacterial in nature. But if encephalitis goes unchecked, that can result in death, again, because the brain, as we've discussed in earlier lectures, the brain is encased in bone. And so inflammation of the brain or regions of the spinal cord are very problematic because there's nowhere for that tissue to swell. Okay, and then as I was mentioning a moment ago, I want you to be familiar with Huntington's and Parkinson's disease. So both Huntington's and Parkinson's are disorders that have a major motor component to them. So they are, with Huntington's disease, this is a hereditary disease that affects the cerebral nuclei. And again, cerebral nuclei play a very important role in kind of refining motor output. And so with Huntington's disease, it's this progressive disease in which the cerebral nuclei essentially are destroyed over time. And so some of the earlier clinical manifestations of Huntington's are disruptions in motor output. So, kind of some people report developing what they think is an essential tremor, or problems with coordination. And then what happens with Huntington's is, again, it's progressive. And so after about, somewhere between 10 and 20 years, that those impairments of motor output essentially are not compatible with life. So the motor functions that are impaired are not just those that are under conscious control, but starts to impair the ability for respiration and heart regulation of heart rate and blood pressure and things of that nature. And then Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is an autoimmune disease that affects, essentially, that destroys the substantia nigra. So the substantia nigra, again, is where many of the neurons that secrete dopamine are located. So with Parkinson's disease, what you see is this progressive loss of dopamine. And so some of the clinical manifestations of Parkinson's are problems with motor output and coordination. And then there's also a kind of an emotional flatness that occurs, or at least an inability to express emotion. So that's where the flat affect comes from, and difficulties with emotional regulation and experience, again, pain threshold and inability to experience pleasure. All of those things are associated with Parkinson's. Okay, other components of the midbrain that I want you to be familiar with. So the tegmentum contains, or a part of the tegmentum is what we call the red nuclei, which are called red nuclei because of the blood supply in that area. And so that blood supply gives the red nuclei this red appearance under the microscope. The tegmentum plays an important role in, again, motor control. So specifically in helping to refine involuntary types of motor output. Cerebral aqueduct, I talked about. I just want you to be familiar with it in the context of cerebral spinal fluid, the flow of cerebral spinal fluid through the brain. And then when it comes to the tectum, so the superior and inferior colliculi together make up what we call the corpora quadrigemina. And what I want you to know about the corpora quadrigemina, or the colliculi, is that the superior colliculi play an important role in controlling so visual reflexes, involuntary visual reflexes, and then the inferior colliculi play an important role in refining or controlling involuntary auditory reflexes, so involuntary responses to auditory information. So for example, if somebody claps, or if you hear a sound without even realizing, before you're consciously aware of the sound, you will turn toward that sound, and that's controlled by the inferior colliculi. Same goes for superior when it comes to visual information. If something runs across in your peripheral vision, your eyes will divert in that direction, and your eyes will do so before it's even registered with your brain on a conscious level that there's been movement. Okay, and then the pons. So the pons and the medulla oblongata uh, work kind of hand in hand. So the pons, they're, as far as the functions of the pons are concerned, the pons are responsible for controlling involuntary types, voluntary um, types of movements that are associated with important visceral responses. So for example, the pontine respiratory center, um, within the pontine respiratory center, or this center is neurons that make up this center are responsible for controlling the skeletal muscles that are involved with breathing. So breathing, breathing itself is an involuntary type, it's an involuntary motor response. However, we can alter our breath, right? We can alter rate and depth of breathing. And so um, our ability to, the neurons that are responsible that allow for that are found in the pontine respiratory center. As far as the cranial nerve nuclei, I'm not going to ask you that, and I'm not going to ask you about the olivary complex either. I just want you to know that the pons plays a really important role in regulating kind of those responses that ultimately are responsible for keeping us alive, right? Again, like breathing. And it's an area, it connects the brain to the spinal cord along with the medulla oblongata. So as far as the medulla oblongata is concerned, this is the most inferior region of the brain before we get to the spinal cord. So all of the tracts that come from the brain are going to pass through the medulla before they make their way to the spinal cord. There's decussation that occurs at the medulla, within the medulla oblongata. So that's a crossing over again. Think of the phenomenon by which the left side of the body, or I'm sorry, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body, and vice versa. And then as far as functions that are concerned with the medulla oblongata, so again, the medulla works with the pons in order to regulate essential types of visceral activities. So within the medulla, we have we have the what we call the respiratory center, we have what we call the vasomotor center, and the cardiac center. And these are the parts of the brain that are ultimately responsible for controlling heart rate and blood pressure, and the variables that or the factors that ultimately control those functions. So for example, with blood pressure, one of the major ways in which our bodies regulate blood pressure is by varying the diameter of the vessels through which blood runs. And so, and vasoconstriction and vasodilation are ultimately controlled by the medulla oblongata. Within the respiratory center of the medulla, this is where those automatic responses by which you breathe, again, breathing is not under conscious control. You don't decide to breathe, or actually a better way to put it is that you continue to breathe even when you're asleep, right? When there's technically no level of consciousness that is going on. And that automatic, not reflex, but that automatic breathing response is generated and controlled by the medulla. And then within the pontine, again, the pontine houses neurons that are associated with your regulation of breathing, voluntary regulation of breathing. Another important, and then the cardiac center is kind of tied to that vasomotor center in the sense that heart rate and blood pressure are ultimately controlled from the medulla. Our center of emesis, so our vomiting, that reflexes, or that response is also controlled within the medulla oblongata. And I bring that up in part because for anybody who's ever worked in a kind of clinical or an EMS type setting, when head injuries take place, if an individual sustains, I guess to finish that thought, if anybody's worked within in EMS services, you'll know that if someone has a head injury and then they start to kind of violently start vomiting shortly after getting a head injury, that's a very ominous sign. And the reason it's ominous is because that can be a manifestation of damage to the medulla, and subsequent inflammation that's happening. And so it might begin with vomiting, but then end with inflammation that impairs the cardiac center and the respiratory center, which would shut down your respiratory drive and cause irregularities or anomalies in blood pressure and heart rate that could be lethal. And then don't worry about, I'm not going to test you on information from this slide. So I'm going to skip over it. Okay, and then the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is that part of the brain. Hold on, I need a sip of water. Is the part of the brain that structurally speaking has a very kind of unique appearance. When if you take a cross section, or if you view a cross section through the cerebellum, it's got this very characteristic kind of tree-like pattern, or it kind of looks like broccoli. It's called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. And then from a functional standpoint, the cerebellum plays, let me actually say before I get into this, the cerebellum, this is what we know about the cerebellum. Again, so much of the brain we're still researching and still discovering. But what we know the cerebellum plays an important role in is motor output when it comes to coordination of past experiences and your ability to do something to refine motor output based on past experiences. So for example, rehearsal. I have on there playing the scales on the piano. So if you are a pianist or if you play the piano, you practice scales. And the more you practice those scales, the more fluid your motion becomes over time, right? Your ability to do that is controlled by the cerebellum. So the motor output for in this particular example, playing the scales on piano, that motor output is run through the cerebellum, and the cerebellum integrates that motor output with past experiences of you doing that same motion and allows you to do that motion faster and with greater refinement. The cerebellum is kind of like the hypothalamus. Well, actually all parts of the brain, I should say, are very sensitive to alcohol. I always use that as an example because so many people are familiar with it. So the cerebellum is very sensitive to alcohol, and sobriety tests, field sobriety tests are essentially testing the cerebellum, right? So the field sobriety tests include activities by which, for example, you have to walk on a straight line with your eyes closed. If under the influence of whatever the determined amount of alcohol is, that causes an effect on the cerebellum. Under that influence, or if that amount of alcohol is consumed, your ability to close your eyes and still control that motor output is negatively impacted. And so people lose their sense of balance. Closing your eyes and being able to touch the tip of your finger to the tip of your nose, again, that's a kind of refined motor movement that if the cerebellum is affected. And sorry to interrupt, but can everybody check to make sure that you're muted? Because I'm recording this and the background information background noise will get recorded. Hold on. I can hear somebody's. Hold on. Okay, again, everybody check. I'm trying to see how to get back to this page where I can check it, but please check to make sure you're muted. Okay, there. Oops, sorry. Okay, so that's what I want you to know about the cerebellum, which is what this slide goes over. So again, cerebellum, control of motor output, involved with equilibrium, balance, refinement of motor output based on rehearsal, things of that nature. Okay, I covered what I want to say on that side. And then kind of finishing up with some of the functional brain systems. So the limbic system is the system that's made up of structures that are involved in your emotional response. So those specific structures are the hypothalamus, which we've discussed, the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is a structure that we find that plays what the hippocampus does. It plays a really important role in memory formation. So it is when we'll talk about memory formation here in just a second. And the way we store, process, and store information is that information is has to go through essentially a series of steps before it gets stored in the cerebrum as long-term memory. And so the hippocampus is the structure that's involved in our ability to form what we call short-term memories. And in order to have long-term memory, those experiences first have to be encoded into short-term memory. So, so in that sense, hippocampus is ultimately just involved with memory as a whole, because you always have to have short-term memories before you have long-term, before you can store that information in long-term memory. But if the hippocampus is, if let's say, for the first 20 years of your life, your hippocampus is intact, and then at the age of 21, you get in an accident and the hippocampus is damaged. People with damage to the hippocampus still retain their long-term memories because those are stored in the cerebrum. It's stored in the cerebral cortex. However, your ability to form short-term memories is impaired. So if damage to the hippocampus occurs, damage experiences that are subsequent to that damage don't get encoded into long-term memory. Yeah, so that's the hippocampus. The amygdala we already talked about, but again, think of the amygdala as being the part of the brain that's responsible for your interpretation and response to fear, your emotional response to fear. So when damage to the amygdala occurs, individuals can either have inappropriate emotional responses to specific situations. So something that would typically make people laugh, the individual might weep instead of laughing. Fear responses are altered. So for most of us, standing, I don't know, at the edge of a cliff and looking down generates a fear response. But if someone damages their amygdala in that same situation, they might look down and not experience any fear at all, or an altered sense of fear. The olfactory bulbs and olfactory tract are also an important part of the limbic system. So, we don't have time to go into in this class much detail when it comes to the role of olfaction when it comes to memories and emotion of things of that nature. Just suffice it to say that of all of the senses that we have, your sense of smell and the various smells that are out there, I can't remember the exact number, but there's a pretty tremendous ability for your brain to process and differentiate between different smells. But that is, of all the senses that we have, that is the sense that is most powerfully associated with memory and with emotion. And then the fornix is kind of the lower lip on the lateral ventricle, and much like the corpus callosum, allows for communication between structures. So the fornix ultimately is the part of the brain that allows for communication between the hippocampus and the amygdala and the olfactory bulbs. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say about that. The reticular formation, is it's a functional system, and its function is awareness, right? So level of consciousness. It involves parts of the brain that essentially incorporate and integrate information that again keeps you aware, and is involved to some degree with, or not to some degree, largely involved with attention, right? So it's the reticular formation and what we call the reticular activating system that ultimately allows you to, for example, if you are in a busy cafeteria with a lot of noise and you are trying to study for a test, It is the reticular act, actually, let me say this a different way. For many people, when studying for a test or when you need to concentrate on a particular topic or really focus and concentrate on something, it is for many people, it's doing this or doing that in an area where there's a lot of background information kind of heightens your ability to focus. And that is because of the reticular formation. So the reticular formation is, and that's because, or it's theorized that that's likely because of the stimulation, the number of neurons that are involved in allowing you to focus on something while filtering out background information. It keeps you alert. That background information essentially keeps you alert, and therefore, for many people, kind of heightens your ability to focus. Oh, sorry, guys. This is a remnant of something I leave in for my face-to-face classes. But anyway, it's just a trivia question. How are we on time? Okay, so I'm not going to spend any time on this slide because I'm kind of running out of time. But just there are different degrees of homeostatic imbalances that are related to consciousness and unconsciousness. So, and those range from fainting to coma. I'll let you kind of read that on your own. And then when it comes to higher order brain functions, right? So higher order brain functions are made possible by the cerebrum, as we've already discussed. Some important features of this. So there are portions of what we call the prefrontal, so that your seat of logic and your ability to critically think is controlled in kind of the most anterior portion of the brain, in an area that we call the prefrontal cortex. So if you think of the part of your brain that's essentially directly behind your forehead, that's the prefrontal cortex. That part, when it comes to maturation, and maturation when it comes to nervous tissue, is by way of myelination. So the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully myelinate until we're in kind of our very, very late teens, early 20s, which it's theorized that to some degree maybe not accounts for, but and maybe partially explains why teenagers by and large are not well known for their impulse control, right? And that is likely due to the fact that part of the brain is not completely mature when we are 16 years old. And so we kind of lack the ability to critically think the way we maybe would when we're 25. So that's an important thing I want you to know. When it comes to brain growth, so by the time we're 5, from a size standpoint, our brain is about 95% of the way done when it comes to growth. And then again, when it comes to critical thinking or cognition, that is controlled by the cerebrum and most specifically by the prefrontal cortex, and then by the association of the different areas within the cerebrum that we've discussed. And we know, I should say, much of what we know about the brain, we know because we look at loss of function associated with damage. So, for example, when we were discussing the different functions associated with the lobes, those kind of findings or that information came to light by looking at patients with damage to specific areas and then looking at changes in behavior or cognition. So, for example, if somebody has damage to the occipital lobe vision, the ability for that person to take in sensory visual information and interpret it is impaired. Damage occurs to Broca's and Wernicke's area, language, the ability to both written and spoken language is impaired. So a term that I want you to know is agnosia. So agnosia, though that group of disorders describes an inability or an impairment to give meaning to stimuli. There are different types of agnosia that exist. I just want you to be familiar with that term. Okay, so we are out of time. I know we're so close to the end, but let's stop with this slide with memory, and then tomorrow I'll finish up with the last few slides from this PowerPoint, and then we'll go through the slides, the information that I want you to know from chapters 14 and 15, which, if you saw the breakdown, 10 questions will